What is the Schomburg Center? To me, it is home. The place where we come to see who we really are, not just somebody else's reflection of who we are.
The Schomburg Center is a place of culture, it's a place of history, it's a place of knowledge.
The Schomburg Center, to me, is a repository of all of the things that has documented our sense of worth as a people.
For me, that means that it is a place of immense power.
The Schomburg Center is a public research library and a cultural institution
for the study of the Pan-African world.
It is perhaps the best in the world.
My Schomburg Center is Arturo Alfonso Schomburg.
Arturo Schomburg said, Black history and culture and intellect exists at a time when most people didn't believe that. He collected those evidences, and that became the beginning of the collection.
And it has expanded and has grown to where it is now a world-class institution.
It holds over 10 million items.
There's no parallel anywhere that brings to light what we as people of color have done, what we continue to do.
Black culture is all of culture. The universals that animate everyone's life happen here for all people.
The Schomburg for me is one of the center pillars of Harlem. When I started the journey of finding out about Red Rooster and Harlem, the very first place I went to was the Schomburg.
Researchers from around the world come and use what we have here.
I could not have written just about any of the books that I've written without the Schomburg Center's archives, resources.
The Schomburg Center is much more than a library. We encourage lifelong learning and exploration.
The Junior Scholars Program is a Saturday program with students from 5th grade to senior year in high school to help them learn about Black history and culture.
Learning about my history is important because it teaches me who I am.
The Schomburg Junior Scholars Program is going to do nothing but uplift them.
So many talented and brilliant people have walked the corridors of this amazing institution over the years. From Octavia Butler to Toni Morrison and James Baldwin, Ella Fitzgerald, Alvin Ailey, and Harry Belafonte, who graced the stage in this room of the American Negro Theater.
This place evokes great memories. It was a gift to us in our community to really try to find that space to reflect expressions of Black experience. I just knew that the environment and what I saw these young African Americans doing was a place I needed to be.
What is my Schomburg Center? I'm standing here at the Cosmogram, which underneath holds the ashes of the poet Langston Hughes. On the evening when this Cosmogram was dedicated, people began to empty out of the auditorium. A jazz trio struck up, and to my amazement, Amira Baraka went over and asked Maya Angelou for a dance. And they started to dance on top of the Cosmogram, on top of the ashes of Langston Hughes, and I felt what a fitting way to kiss the memory of Langston.
The Schomburg Center is a research institute and a library, but it's so much more than that.
There's something going on every day.
So many amazing people come here to talk about their creative craft, to share what inspires them. The Schomburg Center's collections help to tell stories even beyond our walls.
The Schomburg Center is here in this exhibition at MoMA, One Way Ticket, Jacob Lawrence's Migration Series. We depend on the resources of the Schomburg to enable us to tell this story. Thinking about the implications of the past on the present is absolutely crucial for understanding the next steps, understanding what we have to do to go forward.
We today have the responsibility of making sure that new artists and activists, new scholars and poets know that this place continues to be a resource and a source of inspiration for the work that we must continue to do.
The Schomburg Center is knowledge.
The Schomburg Center, to me, is education.
The Schomburg Center is home, it is family, it is foundational.
The Schomburg Center is inspiration.
The Schomburg is with me in everything that I do.
Community, inside and out.
The Schomburg Center is us.
The Schomburg Center is you, and we invite each and every one of you to find your Schomburg Center.
Good evening and welcome. It is so wonderful to be here tonight in this beginning of 2024. This is our 11th season of Conversations in Black Freedom Studies. Kamosi Woodard and I started conversations in collaboration with the Schomburg Center more than a decade ago to create a space where the public could engage with new works in Black social movement history, with fewer and fewer public spaces to engage with new work, with bookstores closing. Conversations in Black Freedom Studies was conceived of as a way to hear, to listen, and to discuss new work in Black history that helps us see the present more clearly. We are so very pleased and honored that the Schomburg Center has continued this series as one of their educational and public programming offerings. We are grateful to Lucien Baskin, who is our outreach and social media coordinator, and to Park Boulevard for the tech tonight. Please follow us at Schomburg CBFS and at our website, blackfreedomstudies.org. We will be here again online on the first Thursday of February. We are always here on the first Thursday of the month, as many of you who have been with us for years know. So Thursday, February 1st, we will be talking about the modern Black freedom struggle before Brown with Matthew Delmont, Margaret Burnham, Dylan Penningroth, and Cookie Woolner. Now on to you, Robin.
Welcome to our conversation, an urgent one as we consider the life and legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King. We're so delighted to be together online for this timely conversation at a new moment of political organizing and uprising, and in this month in which we pay tribute to Dr. King. That has been the goal of conversations from the beginning, 11 years ago, focusing on the history we need to see in order to see a way forward. And tonight feels even more urgent than ever. Part of what we hope to do tonight with you and our guests will be to listen and to hear Dr. King and Coretta Scott King anew. Please remember that this recording will continue to be available afterwards on YouTube, so please share it with people who might be interested in catching up. I'm delighted and honored to introduce tonight's panelists. Their books are available in the Schomburg shop online and in Harlem. And if you're watching us on YouTube, you'll be able to look into the chat and see more information on how to learn more about our esteemed guests. So Brandon Terry. Dr. Terry is the John L. Loeb Associate Professor of the Social Sciences at Harvard University and the co-director of the Institute on Policing, Incarceration, and Public Safety at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. He's also the co-author of To Share a World. Gwendolyn Zoharah Simmons joined the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, as a student at Spelman College. She's continued to work for racial and global justice her entire life, and we welcome her especially warmly as a movement veteran. She's a senior lecturer emerita following her retirement from the University of Florida in 2019. Our third guest is Traci Parker, Dr. Traci Parker, who's an associate professor of history at the University of California, Davis, and a co-author of The New Civil Rights Leader.
So we wanted to begin tonight, as Robin was saying, with the words of Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King. And we decided that Robin and I should also share one of our favorite passages. Part of our goal tonight, as Robin was saying, was to listen to them anew, to hear them, to reckon with the fullness of what they are saying, because I think many times, and obviously in the coming weeks, we will honor them, but to sit with them tonight. I am currently working on a new book on Martin Luther King's longstanding challenge to Northern racism and Northern liberalism that begins with him and Coretta Scott King's sort of coming of age in the Jim Crow North. But the passage I'm actually going to read from tonight comes from 1967, where he's giving a speech to the American Psychological Association, and he brings together kind of his long-standing critique of culture of poverty theories, his long-standing challenge to structural racism, to police brutality, not just in the South, but in the North. But it's a very concise paragraph. A profound judgment of today's riots was expressed by Victor Hugo a century ago. He said, "If a soul is left in darkness, sins will be committed. The guilty one is not who commits the sin, but he who causes the darkness. The policymakers of white society have caused the darkness." They create discrimination. They structured the slums, and they perpetuate unemployment, ignorance, and poverty. It is incontestable and deplorable that Negroes have committed crimes, but they are derivative crimes. They are born of the greater crimes of the white society. When we ask Negroes to abide by the law, let us also demand that the white man abide by law in the ghettos. Day in and day out, he violates welfare laws to deprive the poor of their meager allotments. He flagrantly violates building codes and regulations. His police make a mockery of law, and he violates laws on equal employment and education and the provisions for civic services. The slums are the handiwork of a vicious system of the white society. Negroes live in them but do not make them any more than a prisoner makes a prison. Let us say boldly that if the violations of law by the white man in the slums over the years were calculated and compared with the lawbreaking of a few of the riots, the hardened criminal would be the white man. King's words reach directly to us today. Robin?
So powerful, Jean. Thank you for sharing that. This is going to be, I know, the favorite part of of this program is just to hear, to really listen and try to understand. And it gives a whole different perspective on legacy. It's a new way of getting to know the Kings, and especially Coretta Scott King, right? Our three authors today have really provided new vantage point into these amazing lives. They've learned to know them intimately, from the archives, from their writings, from personal acquaintance even, and through shared struggle. And they've also thought deeply about teaching King, reading King, and writing about King. One of the things that my research on the anti-Vietnam War movement has emphasized is Coretta Scott King's longstanding role as a peace activist. So tonight I want to share some of her words and also highlight some of her actions. On April 27, 1968, she stood in for her husband who had been killed just a few weeks before. She was a newly widowed woman, a mother of 4 children, aged 12, the youngest being 5. And she said, I'm going to read from parts of her speech where she talks about coming there to New York. If you were in the building of the Schomburg Library, we'd be in Harlem, but I know you're joining us from all over the world. But she's talking about coming to New York at this pivotal moment and trying to share her analysis. I come to New York today with a strong feeling that my dearly beloved husband, who was snatched suddenly from our midst slightly more than 3 weeks ago now, would have wanted me to be present today. She goes on to say, my husband always saw the problem of racism and poverty here at home and militarism abroad as 2 sides of the same coin. In fact, it's even very clear that our policy at home is to try to solve social problems through military means, just as we have done abroad. She then went on to say, the interrelatedness of domestic and foreign affairs is no longer questioned. The bombs we drop on the people of Vietnam continue to explode at home with all of their devastating potential. And I would then like to invite you to join us in Washington in our efforts to enable the poor people of this nation to enjoy a fair share of America's blessings. There's no reason why a nation as rich as ours should be blighted by poverty, disease, and illiteracy. It's plain that we don't care about our poor people except to exploit them as cheap labor and victimize them through excessive rents and consumer prices. Our Congress passes laws which subsidize corporations, farms, oil companies, airlines, and houses for suburbia. But when they turn their attention to the poor, they suddenly become concerned about balancing the budget, and they cut back on the funds for Head Start, Medicare, and mental health appropriations. The most tragic of these cuts is the welfare section of Social Security Amendment, which freezes federal funds for millions of needy children who are desperately poor but do not receive public assistance. It forces mothers to leave their children and accept worker training, leaving their children to grow up in the streets as tomorrow's social problems. This law must be repealed, And I encourage you to join Welfare Mothers on May 12th, Mother's Day, and call upon Congress to establish a guaranteed annual income instead of these racist and archaic measures. These measures which dehumanize God's children and create more social problems than they solve. This passage reminds us of the fullness of King's vision, Coretta Scott King's words, especially her longstanding peace activism, commitment to economic justice, and support of a guaranteed annual income resonates deeply in this moment. And of course, her actions as a mother, a partner, a political supporter, a new widow, as a Black woman who felt deeply the violence of America. Her passage reminds us fundamentally of the humanity of the Kings.
Thank you. Yeah, this is certainly going to be the highlight of the evening. So we want to turn it over to each of you to ask each of you to share a short passage or one of your favorite texts from either Martin or Coretta. Please read it and then maybe explain how you encountered it or why it speaks to you this evening. Brandon, let's start with you.
Well, first off, I just want to say thank you for having me. Thank you for having this forum. Congratulations on 11 years of running this extraordinary session. We're starved for this kind of work, and it's an enormous achievement that you should all be applauded for. I come to you from a campus that has been on the front page of newspapers around the world for the horrific treatment that my friend and colleague, President Claudine Gay, has endured with her intelligence being questioned, her scholarship being impugned, our very standing as full members of this scholarly community being treated with derision. And the last straw of that was, I guess yesterday, it's all blurring together now, but one of the leaders of that movement to expel her from office, Bill Ackman, a billionaire donor, quoted Dr. King and his screed against diversity, equity, and inclusion work, saying that, of course, the famous I dream of a day when my children will be judged by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. And as a rejoinder, the quote that is on my mind today is from 1967's Where Do We Go From Here? And it reads as follows. The white liberal must affirm that absolute justice for the Negro simply means, in the Aristotelian sense, that the Negro must have his due. There is nothing abstract about this. It is as concrete as having a good job, a good education, a decent house, and a share of power. It is, however, important to understand that giving a man his due may often mean giving him special treatment. I am aware of the fact that this has been a troublesome concept for many liberals, since it conflicts with their traditional ideal of equal opportunity and equal treatment of people according to their individual merits. But this is a day which demands new thinking and the revaluation of old concepts. A society that has done something special against the Negro for hundreds of years must now do something special for him in order to equip him to compete on a just and equal basis. The white liberal must rid himself of the notion that there can be a tensionless transition from the old order of injustice to the new order of justice.
Zoharah, you're muted.
Thank you for inviting me to join you with this important conversation tonight. One of the many favorite speeches of Dr. King's that resonate for me is his Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence speech, which was given on April 4th, 1967. And I note that King was assassinated on that same day, 1 year later, on April 4th, 1968. And many of us including my dear friend Vincent Harding, my mentor and friend who wrote the draft of the speech, believed that it was this speech that sort of cemented the assassination of Dr. King. But I learned recently that he had given an earlier speech on Vietnam, of which I was not aware, on February 25th, 1967, at a day-long symposium with 4 anti-war U.S. senators in Beverly Hills, California. And it is equally as relevant, especially so in this time of severe censorship and the castigation of any of us who call for a ceasefire to the genocide in Gaza. Dr. King said, quote, "We cannot remain silent as our nation engages in one of history's most cruel and senseless wars. America must continue to have, during these days of human travail, a company of creative dissenters. We need them because the thunder of their fearless voices will be the only sound stronger than the blast of bombs and the clamor of war hysteria. Those of us who love peace must organize as effectively as the war hawks. As they spread the propaganda of war, we must spread the propaganda of peace. We must combine the fervor of the civil rights movement with the peace movement. We must demonstrate, teach, and preach until the very foundation of our nation are shaken. We must work unceasingly to lift this nation we love to a higher destiny, to a new plateau of compassion, to a more noble expression of humaneness. Dr. King's words resonated with me then and now, as I had become, when he gave these words, a proponent of world peace in SNCC, which was the first civil rights organization to speak out against the war in Vietnam and against the Israeli occupation of Palestine. Most of us in SNCC were attempting to understand not only US politics, but what was happening in the world. At the end of the 1964 Mississippi Freedom Summer Project, a SNCC delegation traveled to several African countries and learned about the anti-colonial movements and the liberation struggles that many of them had engaged in, that had liberated them from colonialism. Through their eyes, we became citizens of the world.
First off, I also want to thank you all for having me today. This is great to be in discussion with all of you. The quotes so far have been amazing. And I'm hoping that maybe the one I chose sort of ties it all together. It's clear that Martin and Coretta had a shared view of the world, had shared interests, had shared goals. And so the passage I want to share with all of you is actually from an interview that she had with a senior editor at Holt Publishing Company when she was working on the book My Life with Martin Luther King Jr. that was published in 1969, a year after he was assassinated. And in this quote, she's grappling with the prospect of marrying King, who had decided on their very first date that she was the woman that he was going to marry. And she remained quite unconvinced for some time. And so she says, after we began to talk a little more seriously about marriage, and he talked about it more frequently, I began to think about it when I wasn't with him. Is this what I want, you know? I always said that I didn't want to marry a minister, but he's not a typical minister. He's very broad-minded. He's very intelligent. And then finally I said, I've always said I wanted to live my life of service. I've wanted to devote my life to servicing my fellow man. This is what I've said many times, and being in terms of life was going to be like, and what my life's aims were at Antioch, and the thing about going to college. I went to college to get an education. I wanted to get an education to better myself, yes, but also so I could make a contribution to society. What I had thought, I would do it through music. Then I finally said, well, now if I'm serious about this commitment to service, then I can think of no better way than to serve as a minister's wife. However, I wanted to be sure that the person that I loved, I believe there should be love, should have other things in common, so you can make the kind of relationship that was necessary to grow into a beautiful marriage. I realized that marriage wasn't the end, It was a continuing process of growth and development together. She goes on to say that she prayed about whether she should marry Martin for about 2 to 3 months before she finally goes ahead and she accepts his proposal. But it's very clear from the outset that she has a vision that they should have a collaborative partnership. And that's really, I think, what helps keep the movement going and keeps them going as well.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing those, I think, weaving together all of those perspectives, so important, especially because, as Brandon points out, Dr. King's words, Coretta Scott King's words, are oftentimes misplaced and utilized in agendas that are very different from what they may have imagined. I wanted to give you all an opportunity to teach us something, right? Give us a window into your work and bring us into the worlds of Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King, two figures that we're all very familiar with, it seems, and yet there's so much we don't know or that we miss. What is your intervention? How can we understand and sort of place your work? And we'll start with you, Traci.
Thank you. So, I've come across the King. I've always studied Martin Luther King and Coretta for their activism, but their marital relationship has recently become more of a focal point of investigation, particularly in my current book that I've tentatively titled Beyond Loving, Love, Sex, and Marriage in the Black Freedom Movement. What I'm doing in this project is examining romantic relationships in the civil rights and Black power movements. Historians have been largely concerned with love in the movement. Those that have focused on agape, right? The love of God and mankind as the basis for nonviolent resistance. They've also focused a lot on the Supreme Court decision in Loving v. Virginia, right? This 1964 legal case that outlawed anti-miscegenation laws. In the process, however, what I believe has happened is that we as scholars have missed or underappreciated the importance of romantic love and relationships in the civil rights revolution. So my work seeks to correct this. It focuses a lot on interracial Black relationship, but it's also attentive to interracial ones. And it argues that activists politicize, sometimes consciously, more often than not unconsciously and subconsciously, their romantic love. And they were experimenting with the structure of their relationships with the hope of realizing Black liberation. Studying these relationships have provided a fuller sense of activist lives and experiences in the movement. They spotlight the ways that the quieter or lesser known half of the couple was often just as active and dedicated to the movement as the one who was out front leading a march or being photographed or shown on the front page of newspapers. These relationships in so many ways were collaborative and revolutionary. They both as a unit, but also individually, were aiming to dismantle racial segregation and discrimination, but also because of their often shared ideological perspectives and the demands of the movement were challenging traditional gender and marital norms. So in other words, some of the relationships reveal that liberation was being birthed just as much as in the public sphere as it was in the private. And I think the King's relationships speak quite a bit to this. She recounts when they first meet that she talks to him he calls her on the telephone there. Sort of a friend of theirs match makes. And She said he's a smooth talker. He talks a lot of jive. Intellectual jive is actually the phrase that she uses. And she finally agrees to go on a date. She gives him about 1 hour, a 12-to-1. He comes to pick her up in his Chevy truck. And she said her first thought was that he's short. She just couldn't get over it. She kept going, he's so short. But she said as he kept talking, he became so charming. He was smart. He was committed to the same causes that she was committed to. They talk about capitalism versus communism on the first date. And the date ends, and on the way back to the conservatory, she's at the New England Conservatory at the time, and he's at Boston University working on his doctorate. He says, you're the woman I want. You've got the 4 qualities. You're the woman I want. And she's just like, but you don't know me. She's just not very convinced. And he asked her out on the second date, and she said, give me a call. But it's very clear on that first date that she's independent, that she's a free thinker, she's a feminist. And this continues through their marriage. At their wedding ceremony, she's adamant about not wearing white. She wears a blue dress. And to me, blue is a symbol of freedom. She has the marital vows changed. She takes the obey and submit portions out. She said at one point in time, she felt like those words would make her feel like an indentured servant to him. And that's not the type of union she wanted to have. She keeps her maiden name, something that we often overlook. And then she talks about how in her first and second year of marriage, she would be off at school getting her education, and Martin would do the food shopping. He would do all the heavy cleaning. He did the washing. He did the cooking. There's a relationship that they are cultivating that I think is essential for how they imagine a world, right? One that they would create privately, but also publicly.
It's amazing work. I'm so excited for this book. My work comes out of political philosophy, political theory. And one of my earliest experiences as an undergraduate was that I was somebody who had come out of reading that was dominated by Black nationalism. So I had a particular view of what Martin Luther King meant. I grew up during Malcolmania in the 90s, where there are a lot of caricatures of King floating around. And I was assigned it in college. It's the first time I never even really thought about it, that he wrote books. It's just all I knew was the speeches. And really only one of those. And so I'm handed this book, and it's where do we go from here? And I'm just blown away. And it was one of those early experiences that I think, if you take your college education seriously, you can really have, where you realize a thing that you've been told just isn't accurate, and you come to find it out for yourself in a really immersive way. And I just got obsessed with learning all I could about, well, what does he really think? And how persuasive are his criticisms of Black nationalism? And how do I think about his critique of political economy? And over time, I just began to really identify my own political philosophy with his in most respects. And so I've devoted much of my career to trying to think through Dr. King's ideas, to take him seriously as a systematic political philosopher, and try to explain why that hasn't happened so far. How is it that this could be the most famous African-American of the 20th century, arguably, and maybe alongside Muhammad Ali? How is it that this person could be so well known and such a prolific writer, but we don't know any of the writings? And part of that story is about kind of romantic history of the civil rights movement that we tell and that we situate him in, and a way we think about Black intellectuals and activists generally, that really what they're up to, particularly on the liberal side or the left side, is telling us what we already know, calling us to who we've always already been, and that their real innovation is about rhetoric and about tactics. And so for philosophers, none of that's really that interesting at the end of the day. I mean, you might argue about civil disobedience or something like that, but not as a thinker, because he's just telling you things you think you already know. And so what I've devoted my work to is a kind of two-pronged assault. One is trying to recover his thinking, and that's what To Shape a New World is all about, and a lot of my essays are all about. And a much bigger project that will come out in the winter, which is called The Tragic Vision of the Civil Rights Movement, which is a sweeping philosophical rethinking of the historiography of the civil rights movement, all of the debates around how to tell that story and the way that those stories get picked up by political philosophers and political activists. So, you know, one of the things I try to show in the book and I'll end here is that we're really stuck between two narrative modes right now. One is this old romantic story about the overcoming of oppression, a more perfect union coming into being. It's mostly a Southern story. It focuses on the heroic period from 54 to 68. King becomes the symbol for that. And that story's lost a lot of its allure for critical thinkers. It doesn't seem to explain the world around us. It doesn't seem to even succeed on its own terms. And that failure has opened the space for a competing ironic narrative that's dominated by what's called Afro-pessimism, that really nothing ever changes, and that racial oppression is the fundamental condition of American life, perhaps even modernity. And the question is there another way of understanding our history that gets us out of these cul-de-sacs and inspires critical thought? And for me, Dr. King is one of the key sources. His work, Shattered Dreams, a sermon he gives that's reprinted in Strength to Love, the work and Where Do We Go From Here, when he says, when he talks about unjustified pessimism and despair and trying to defend the dignity of partial victories and understand defeat as not discrediting the strivings that inspired it. I think all of that operates in what I call a tragic mode. And that King-inspired tragic historical consciousness is the subject of my next book, The Tragic Vision of the Civil Rights Movement.
Wow. I tell you, I can't wait to read both of these, and I look forward to having some conversation with you as a civil rights veteran. Love to be in conversation with you. Of course, I think it's already clear that both Dr. King and Mrs. Coretta Scott King were peace activists. Mrs. King was more out front in her advocacy for an end to the war in Vietnam than was Dr. King for quite a while, as he was reluctant to take on President Lyndon B. Johnson due to Johnson's slavish devotion to pursue the war. But once he threw his hesitancy to speak out due to his fear of injuring his relationship with Johnson, and also because his SCLC colleagues did not want him to speak out about his opposition to the war for fear of losing white support and white donors. King feared being called a communist or a communist sympathizer, anti-American, and a traitor to the country. And of course, we know that Hoover and the FBI were always dogging him and calling him a communist. And I was a SNCC field secretary in the Atlanta project of SNCC. And in 1966, we had begun organizing against the draft and the Vietnam War more generally. A number of my SNCC colleagues and I were demonstrating regularly at the induction center against the draft, stopping recruits who were going into enlist, asking them to reconsider. Also, I and the women in the Atlanta Project demonstrated every morning between 6:30 and 8:30 a.m. in an area of Atlanta called 5 Points. And we were giving out anti-Vietnam War flyers to the thousands of mostly Black women leaving the Black community and getting on buses that took them to the white suburbs, where they worked as nannies, cooks, and housekeepers. We made a new informational flyer every night, often staying up all night to produce it so that we could be out at 6:30 in the morning to give it to them. The women often snatched these flyers from our hands and even missed their buses if we were a bit late, awaiting our arrival with a new flyer for the day. In these flyers, we recounted the body count of U.S. soldiers, especially African Americans. We also wrote about the cost of the war and how those monies could be used here at home to benefit our poor and working class communities. Several of the Atlanta Project staff were arrested at the induction center and given harsh sentences and sent to the penal farm in Atlanta. Ironically, the penal farm was in what is now the site of Cop City, that many citizens in Atlanta and across the country opposed. My former husband, Michael Simmons, was not only arrested during the demonstrations and sentenced to months at the penal farm, but was also charged with resisting the draft and given 3.5 years sentence in a federal penitentiary. So when Dr. King stepped to the forefront of the peace and anti-Vietnam War movement, I was thrilled and embraced his involvement, as I saw no separation between the civil rights and the peace movement. And I am now very involved in peace work today. That is what I'm spending most of my time on. Thank you.
Thank you. Part of what we're doing tonight, and I want us to kind of continue in this vein, is trying to get us past the mythologies that kind of dominate the way we see them, the way that it clouds how we see them. I think Brandon started us off with one of the kind of glaring kind of ways that conservatives misuse Dr. King's words. But what we wanted us to move to now are the ways that even those of us committed to anti-racism, even those of us committed to deep learning of Black history, there are still so many myths and misimpressions of the Kings. And so I want us to kind of, like each of you, to give us maybe one aspect that we've misunderstood, or one myth that even those of us, right, who are not the Bill Ackmans, right, need to understand, both to see kind of the Black freedom struggle more clearly, but also to see where we are today more clearly. And we want to start with you, Zoharah, in part because you knew them, right? Like, what is something we don't understand or we get wrong?
Well, thank you, first of all, for that question. When I reflect back on Dr. King, I recall that he had real humility, and, some people may not know that based on, his oratorical skills and the thundering speeches he gave throughout his life. And his team of SCLC brothers, they looked up to him. They regarded his ideas with respect. But he was not an authoritarian or dictatorial. They saw him as their leader, but when they didn't agree with him, they felt comfortable letting him know that. And he respected them too, and relied upon them for their strategic ideas, their organizing expertise, and their moral support. And they used to really laugh and tussle with each other and wrestle. I mean, it was kind of funny. Now, of course, we in SNCC often made fun of him behind his back, calling him D-Lord, the preacher, etc. And we even said that he was conservative and too accommodating with white officials. And over the years, I have, read about his life, taught about him in my Martin and Malcolm classes. And I now know that I was wrong. He was not the stereotypical pompous preacher type who thought his word was law. From Montgomery until April 4th, his life was not his own. He was cautious and courteous with all, from the most hideous racists to his comrades. Back then, I saw that as a weakness. I now know better. King was carrying a huge burden, more so than most of us who were also carrying burdens of the movement and trying to be the leaders and followers of our people. But he was really carrying the load of being the symbol of the Black movement for liberation, both in this country and internationally, particularly after he won the Peace Prize. We now know about the FBI's constant harassment and bullying and the constant threats on his life. And I think that in those last couple of years, he was very aware that he may not live very long. And he, in fact, said that in his mountaintop speech. So I think that Martin, the man, is someone that we really maybe haven't looked at in the way that we should. And the difficulties that he went through, but yet he soldiered on. So this is, when I think of him, I certainly appreciate the wonderful speeches, the books, and all of that. But I also greatly appreciate his spiritual depth, because I don't believe he would have been able to continue if he hadn't been grounded in such deep spiritual connections with God.
Zoharah, I love that quote. You said his life was not his own. I mean, I think we forget that. We forget that as soon as Montgomery happens, I think Coretta says this at one point in time, even their house in Montgomery, right? Their house in Montgomery becomes sort of the meeting space, the community space. They lose that sense of intimacy and privacy. And that just continues for the duration of their marriage. That is just, I just can't imagine it, right? Like the type of pressure he's under. He's depressed many times throughout his career, and yet he still forges on. And every time he's depressed and he needs a pick-me-up, I mean, Coretta's there. I think that what happens is that his relationship with Coretta has, in recent years, been mired in all of the sex scandal of it. And what we've lost is that intimacy, that connection that they had that allowed both of them to continue, to allow them to raise their four children. I mean, they're doing this all where their children are very young.
Exactly.
And he's trying to be the best father he can be. You know, when he's in town, he tries to take them to school. And there's a sense of trying to give them some sense of normalcy, but also with the idea that they're trying to create a better world for them. I also think that his sexism, too, has become this conversation that as scholars we keep having, but in painting him as a sexist or as a misogynist, I think we lose the ways that maybe he was trying to challenge gender norms, and that Coretta is actually forcing him to do so. I think a lot of people, maybe not among scholars, but in public discourse, we think of Coretta as a helpmate, as his wife, as his homemaker, as maybe his betrayed, this woman who's been betrayed. But he says in a 1965 television interview that she educated him that she was more of an activist when they met than he was. It's because of Coretta. She's doing all the work in Vietnam before he comes out, as you mentioned earlier. I mean, she's a radical. I mean, there's something, I mean, I was talking to Jean earlier today. And I think Jean used to call her a hippie. There's something about her that's really on the cutting edge. She's decades before everybody else. I think it's important to realize that type of what's going on at home and how it then radiates outward and how it then has shaped our perceptions of him, of her, and of the movement.
Yeah, just building on Traci's, incredibly incisive comments. I mean, just the the things people don't know about Coretta Scott King could fill a library. I mean, it's just her peace activism, which we've talked about a lot, but her advocacy for full employment, her work on the freedom budget, even the holiday. I mean, that's something I've changed my mind about a lot as I've really studied her and studied Dr. King. I think, people like Adolph Reed used to criticize the holiday as a grift by the family or a way of Disneyfying King. And I've come to think of it more like the Hansel and Gretel story. Like, she left breadcrumbs in the wilderness when the movement seemed like it was in the wilderness. She left the breadcrumbs by putting that holiday at the center of our civic culture so that they could never again say that this isn't part of the legitimate American political discourse. And that's just an extraordinary achievement, that to lodge this family's arguments, these movements' arguments, in a central space in our symbolic firmament. We will always have to argue about it. We'll always have to contest the particular mode of canonization, a particular mode of remembrance. It'll be reinvented for every era. But still, what an extraordinary achievement. So I think that's one thing that's really important. The other thing I'll say really briefly, it's like, one reason to care a lot about the philosophy part of Dr. King's work is that he's giving arguments. He's giving justifications for the positions he holds. And so even on the left, sometimes people will quote it out of context. I think a lot about the riots quote as the language of the unheard. People don't quite fit that in within a broader view about the nature of political violence. Or they don't really take seriously the way he thinks about virtue, the way he thinks about excellence of character. So a lot of the arguments he makes can sometimes in the contemporary moment be caricatured as a kind of respectability politics in the pejorative sense. So people assume, in part because they don't think of Black intellectuals and Black activists as having a philosophical worldview. They think of them as strategists only, think of them as only responsive to white people and white racism. So they think everything that they advocate is like in response to anti-Black ideas. And actually people have broader worldviews about what does it mean to live a Christian life? What does it mean to live a life of excellence? What does it mean to develop the kinds of virtues, whether they're courage or magnanimity or fidelity or humility, which is a very important one that Professor Simmons mentioned. What does it mean to develop those things? How do you inhabit them? How do you enact them? How do you cultivate them? Why are they important? Why might they even be worth losing a material struggle over to remain committed to your own self-respect, your own dignity, your own excellence of character? So I think that in our contemporary moment gets very, very confused on the left and very, very confused in the classroom because we're just not training students in how to think about that very long tradition that King comes out of. It's got Aristotle, Aquinas, Augustinians, about virtue and the politics of character, which is also what Evelyn Higginbotham meant by the politics of respectability.
So powerful, especially thinking about the breadcrumbs and thinking about our need to contextualize, especially at a moment where decontextualizing things, circulating them as memes, as inspirational quotes is such a common practice. it's so lovely to go back to the sources, and to even go back into thinking about what is the political and philosophical history of some of the terms and some of the framework. So thank you so much for that. We're joined in this conversation by people from all over the world. There's the Philippines are in the house. In the chat, we have folks from everywhere from New Jersey to Florida to Reno, Nevada to Philly, Detroit, the DC area, Maryland, Toronto, Chicago. Hundreds of people are listening, and it's just a really beautiful thing. So I just want to acknowledge our audience for a moment, and also to remind them to use that chat to speak back to or muse off of some of the wonderful insights that we're getting as we go through this conversation today. This is a great question because, as Brandon just pointed out, the teaching of the Kings is so important. And many of us do it even though we may not be employed formally as educators, but we'll be educators in our families, in our communities, in our religious circles, right? So, and especially the King holiday, as you mentioned, becomes a moment of collective relearning about the Kings. So our audience is filled with teachers and learners of all kinds. Can you introduce us to one key event in their lives or one issue they were working on that you think more people should know about? And we'll start with you, Brandon.
Well, there's so many things, and it was very hard for me to come with just one. But the one I want to focus on, just given where we are as a society right now and in the world, is the anti-war work. I think partly because he's one of the most important theorists of nonviolence, Dr. King's critique of the Vietnam War can sometimes be caricatured as a kind of naive pacifism. So if you ever look at Barack Obama's Nobel Prize acceptance speech, a big part of it is structured around distinguishing himself from King and treating King as a kind of, frankly, naive pacifist who has the luxury of being so because he's an activist and not someone who is forced with the weighty responsibility of directing the power of American empire. And one of the things that I've learned from teaching King and reading King, particularly on war, is that the way to think about it is that it's a kind of realism. It's a moral realism. We don't often put those terms together. We often don't think of nonviolence as a kind of realism, but so much of the project is structured around what he calls the virtue of maturity. He says, the world is asking America to display a maturity that we might not be able to. And what does he mean by that? He means that maturity requires knowing that you're not always right, that you can't impose your singular worldview on everyone else, that you have to learn to share and inhabit the world with others, that you have to make amends for things that you do wrong, that you can't kill and steal and destroy in the name of projecting some mythic image that you want people to genuflect toward. And so much of the argument is around trying to disabuse ourselves of that tendency to destroy the world in order to hold aloft a myth of ourselves as acting in the interest of others. It also, and this is I'll end here, he also has this really powerful point about trying to listen to the people who are ostensibly your enemy and understanding their critique of you in order to generate a kind of reflexive attitude toward yourself. That is also maturity. You can't be self-critical if you close yourself off to all the arguments from the other side. You can't exercise maturity if you don't adequately capture the full casualties of war, which are not just on the battlefield, but are about the cost you impose on your own society and the damage you do to the supposed ideals that you're structured around and you're organized around, the kind of spiritual rot you impose on the people who are carrying out these militaristic endeavors.
Brandon, I'm happy you picked anti-war, because in my mind, I was struggling as well as to what one lesson to think of, and so I did not pick anti-war, so that's good. I was thinking about, because I was in the vein of thinking about their collaborative partnership, but also thinking about Coretta as a powerhouse all on her own. I was thinking about the Poor People's Campaign, which I think is often misunderstood as Martin's last project, not something that they had really worked on together towards the end of his life. Coretta really has an understanding of economic instability, and she understands its connection with racial discrimination and bias. And so even as she's mourning her husband, she is committed to this movement, and she remains committed to issues of racial and economic justice up until she dies. I mean, it's just amazing how much activism she does, and I think we don't quite give her the credit she fully deserves on this. I mean, after he passes away, 4 days after, she's back in Memphis, working with the Memphis sanitation workers, right? She's got 50,000 individuals that she's marching alongside. She helps out with the Poor People's Campaign, which frankly is struggling under Ralph Abernathy's leadership. She gets to DC, and her and other women leaders are sort of taking control, and they're center stage at the march in Washington in 1968, which is a stark departure from what happens 5 years prior at the March on Washington. What I find to be fascinating is that not only is, and then on May 1st, she's down at the balcony in Memphis at the Lorraine Motel where King's assassinated, and she serenades the crowd, but she also gives her vision of the world, one that she really talks about eradicating poverty, one where she talks about what liberty and grace really mean. She spends within 2 weeks, she's then back in DC at the Mother's Day March. And then in June, which I just want to end on this quote because I love it every time. She's at the Poor People's March in June of 1968, where she says, quote, "Women, if the soul of this nation is to be saved, you must become its soul." And then she elaborates, "Women must speak out against the evils of our time as you see them, and must compel governments to put an end to every sort of persecution." I just think that it just speaks volumes about where we are right now in society and the role that women continue to need to play and must play in all of the atrocities that are going on.
Thank you. I'm learning so much from the both of you, and really looking forward, as I said earlier, to reading. Of course, being the SNCC vet, I keep taking us back a bit, but I thought it was important for people to know that when Malcolm X was invited by some of the SNCC folk in the in the Alabama project to come down to Selma to speak, and he was hoping that he'd be able to meet with Dr. King, but but Dr. King was in jail. And, there was a lot of controversy at that time about Malcolm. And Mrs. King met with him. It's not that I've found a lot, and maybe hopefully some of you researchers and scholars have dug up more, but it was interesting that the one quote that I did find was that in the private meeting that they had, he assured her that he had not come to Selma to make Dr. King's job more difficult. He said he came thinking that he could make it easier. And of course, I later read somewhere where Martin was not that happy that she had had this meeting with him because, of course, he had given his speech where he talked about the house Negro and the field Negro, and that he was a field Negro, and he disavowed nonviolence. But anyway, I hope that there's more information about what actually happened in that meeting than I have been able to find. The other thing that I wanted to share was that Dr. King never disavowed SNCC during our most radical period, particularly after the Black Power call out that Stokely made on the march that King and Stokely led, the march against fear. Many of these civil rights leaders, they came down on us with a vengeance. And so did the New York Times. And, they were saying that we were as bad as the Ku Klux Klan for calling for Black Power. But King never went there. And he, worked initially in trying to sort of put it in what he thought might be more palatable terms, but he never joined with those who, opposed us. And one of the things that my friend, whom I've mentioned before, and mentor Vincent Harding, said that Dr. King always told him how much he appreciated his radical SNCC comrades who constantly pushed him further than he would have gone if it had not been for them. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you for Zoharah for bringing that part of King up, because I've been thinking a lot about how much he refuses to excommunicate people, and there are all these moments. And since I'm literally in New York, and we are figuratively in New York, one of my favorite moments is when he gets called to disavow Brooklyn Corps' stall-in to the 1964 World's Fair. Brooklyn Corps is going to stall cars on the highway, basically to draw attention to kind of the degree of inequality in New York City that has not been intended to. And you can imagine how mad people are. And people want him to disavow this. And he refuses. And he says, basically, I'm going to paraphrase him, I've heard a lot lately about our direct action talk alienating our friends. If our direct action alienates our so-called friends, they never were really our friends. Mm-hmm. And I think and we can find these examples over and over where people think he's going to be willing to kind of quiet Black people, and he's not. Mm-hmm. So now we're turning to audience questions, and please, if you haven't put a question in the chat, please do so. And I think our first question is for Brandon. And our audience member writes, I'm concerned about Afro-pessimism, as Dr. Terry called it. How prevalent is that? How can it be countered, especially as the US and other Western governments continue to turn towards the right?
No, it's a phenomenal question. I'll make one quick distinction and then say why. So there's a general thing that's just pessimism about whether certain things are going to be possible, particularly in our lifetime, whether that's a truly robust, egalitarian, multiracial democracy, whether that's something like racial justice, which would include various economic dimensions, something like liberation, which might entail the flourishing of vast number of Black people in their personal lives as well as their civic lives. So you could fill in whatever the ideal is, and you might be pessimistic about that in all manner of ways. What I think is really novel about the kind of self-identified Afro-pessimist movement is that it tries to basically work that into a full-blown theory of history, a argument about that being anti-Blackness being the structuring force of the world, of the modern world, and that there being no way out of that. So in a way, it discourages, and people are pretty open about this, it discourages any kind of political action, even the kind of nationalist, separatist action that King was debating and that Professor Simmons mentioned earlier on. Even that stuff is kind of treated as a non-starter. So where I think we are right now is that basically from Obama to Black Lives Matter, I think you had enormously high hopes for at least 2 to 3 generations of young activists, their allies, their sympathizers, and not just Black people. I think it's really important to understand that it's just not just Black people. And those high hopes have crashed into the entrenched nature of economic inequality, the really well-organized hostility from the right around ideas of racial redress or racial reckoning. And one normal response to that is to just become hopeless, to have a real despair and to think that nothing will ever change and that everything we did in the meantime was not really worth it, especially because you're seeing people suffer. You're seeing people struggle as a result of trying to commit themselves to this. And I think the only way out of it is having a different way of telling those stories that tries to hold on to the value of partial victories, that treats the ideals people struggle toward as worthy of affirming in and of themselves, even if they meet defeat in our current moment, and having a really sophisticated theory, which I could talk more about in another forum, a really sophisticated theory of what actually causes Black disadvantage and who among Black people are disadvantaged and which ways. Because I think sometimes we confuse the treatment that elite Black people face versus the treatment that people who are ghettoized and the most disadvantaged neighborhoods face. And that confusion can sometimes create despair in really warped ways. So I think you just have to be precise about those things as you develop a historical consciousness that inspires people to act and endure and persevere even in the face of despair.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Brandon, and just giving us a place to sort of pin and sort of think about these larger questions. A question I wanted to pose to Zoharah in particular, I wanted to just spotlight your article called Martin Luther King Jr. Revisited, a Black Power Feminist Pays Homage to the King. What a wonderful, wonderful title. And in there was a particular quote that kind of spoke to me where you say, and I'm quoting you here, in that article in the Journal of Feminist Studies in Religion, again called The Black Power Feminist Pays Homage to the King, where you say, Dr. King was moving into forbidden waters for Black reformers, for which he would pay with his life. He was a Black man out of place. His assessment of the systemic flaws in the American economy that created poverty and ghettos, with his hints of socialistic remedies, was radical, especially given the rabid anti-communism hysteria that continued to hold this nation in its grip. Can you talk to us a little bit about anti-communism in King's time in the context of repression?
Thank you. Yes, we were definitely faced with charges in the movement, and of course, Dr. King was, as we were in SNCC and CORE, of being, communists, that we were attempting to change our country to a socialist one, a socialist economy, and the fact that we were, singing the praises of some people who were considered enemies, international enemies of the state, certainly made things worse. And then within our organizations, particularly thinking of Bayard Rustin and the work he did with Dr. King and the SCLC, and how initially he was pushed out because he was said to be a communist. And people, King and others, went along with him being pushed out until they had to bring him back, to help organize the March on Washington. But yes, that was something that dogged us. And one of the things, of course, about SNCC was that it didn't give a damn about being called communist. And thank goodness for a while, it didn't stop people from funding us. But this was a definite problem. And Dr. King was moving. I mean, this is one of the things that we really have to think about, is how King was evolving. I mean, he was not staying static. And when he began to question our capitalist system and our militarism and all, this is what added to him becoming an enemy of the FBI and the deep state, as they say. He was questioning things that a Black man, particularly one with thousands of people listening to him and looking to him, he was definitely someone they had to get rid of.
Thank you. Just for everyone who is here from all around the world, we've put the Schomburg Shop link in where you can get, so Brandon Terry co-edited To Shape a World. That's there last year. People may remember Dan Berger was with us. He had just published a dual biography of Zoharah and Michael Simmons. So State on Freedom is there. And then Traci Parker just co-edited a new book called The New Civil Rights Reader. And we wanted to talk about that for a second in the ways that that book brings together sort of a host of different kinds of sources, documents, speeches, photographs. How does that book help us see the Kings differently?
I have to say, this was an interesting, doing an edited collection of primary sources was a struggle. I'm not quite sure I would do it again, but it was a struggle. What I thought was fascinating was King trying to choose something from King, right? The King estate says that you can only reproduce a certain amount. And we really struggled to figure out what pieces that we wanted to publish in that book. But also getting our hands on speeches from Coretta proved to be a really difficult task.
I'm sure.
Oftentimes those speeches have not been transcribed. They are not readily available, which I think speaks a lot to her, how we just have decided to remember her in our, publicly. But all throughout that book, you can see King's influence on different groups. We are very attentive to try to think about King's evolution of thought over time, right? So it's not simply just, the letter from Birmingham jail, I think, is one of his most beautiful pieces, honestly. And that's included, but also his thoughts on Black power are included as well. And it is, I think to read what he actually says, right? Not what people have told you he said, or even try to create this King versus Black power, right? That's just when you read what he's saying and what he's reflecting on the movement. That's not the case. He's very inclusive. And I think that these are the reasons why it was really important for myself and my colleague, Marshall Walker McWilliams, to put these sources together, not only for students, but really for ourselves to some degree. It's a great tool to go back to and remind ourselves how important those words are, how they continue to resonate.
So powerful, Traci, and I intend to use that book in the classroom. I think it sounds so amazing in so many ways to kind of shift a narrative that so many come to the beginning of their learning process already with that preloaded and oftentimes distorted perspective.
Yes.
We have two great questions from the audience that I'm just going to read together so that anyone who wants to answer them can dive right on in. So the first question is about reparations. So thinking through, would Martin Luther King be in favor of reparations for Black people, considering his advocacy for civil rights and economic justice? And then the second question is, in this moment of renewed interest in Bayard Rustin, what can we take away from King's relationship with Rustin? How might the narrative be expanded upon or corrected? So we've got King and reparations, and we've got Rustin. So I'll just throw that out to you, and including us as hosts, and see who wants to dive in and tackle part of that.
Well, let me just say that I certainly don't know of anything, and I know the Traci and you, Brandon, are digging into Dr. King's writings that I've been a bit away from for a time. So I don't know personally that the issue of reparations was one that he and those of us, in the civil rights movement at that time really spent much time thinking about. Of course, clearly prior to our era, if you will, there had been calls for reparations, but I do not recall. But I would believe, given that I have certainly grown and to embrace that idea completely, I would believe that so would King and many of the other persons who were in the movement who have now gone on to the ancestors, to join the ancestors. I do believe they would be in favor of reparations.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. So, people love to quote various things from I Have a Dream, but they don't quote this really stunning thing that he opens with, which is that it's obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. And then he goes on to say, we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt, and we've come to cash a check. And that language of a debt that he uses sets up a whole set of arguments that he uses throughout his career that are about repairing the damage and disadvantage done to Black people by two things. I mean, he's very precise. So, like, one is you're disadvantaged by historically inherited injustices, and you're disadvantaged by contemporary discrimination. Those are not the same thing. Mm-hmm. And because of the inherited disadvantages, sometimes things that have nothing to do with race, like automation, can affect you worse than other people because of where you are in the economy when those things happen.
Exactly.
So he has a weird conception of reparations where he actually talks about it as the abolition of poverty, that really correcting a slave-based economy, a world of racial domination that not only robbed Black people of equal opportunity, but actually ruined the lives of many, many white people as well. So ironically, he talks about reparations as including white people, as including the abolition of poverty for all people and the realization of a kind of citizenship without domination, a citizenship that allows people to live a life of dignity without suffering contempt from their more well-off co-citizens. And so it's a weird conception from how we talk about it, but I actually think it's one that probably has more political valence long term than some of the projects that have been bandied about the last few years.
I mean, just to piggyback off of what Brandon said, there's also a way that his idea of reparations, to my mind, at least when he speaks to Alex Haley in 1965, it's this Playboy interview that he gives where he's talking about employment rights. And Alex Haley asked him, would you be in favor of having a program that would help I think it's hundreds of thousands of African Americans. And he says, yes, he said we should have it. And he goes, and I estimate it would cost, billions of dollars. And I think one of the questions then Haley asked is, would you be in favor of preferential treatment, that preferential treatment be given to African Americans? And King says yes. He says the way society has historically treated African Americans, right? African Americans are owed something, right? Something is due to them. So I very much agree that he would be in favor of some sort of reparations.
Anybody want to take the Rustin?
It's so interesting to me how popular culture kind of brings these historical figures back in key ways, and people want to go beyond what they see and learn more, know more. So given this moment of spotlight on Rustin, is there anything you want to add to the conversation about the King's relationship to him? And is there anything to correct in the narrative that's being renewed in the public in this moment?
Well, let me just say, I really can't, and I've seen the recent film about him, and I've read all these reviews, and, a lot of people hate it. And of course, the few times that, I actually was in the same room with Mr. Rustin, we were planning something, and I just have no sense of his relationship with Dr. King as, personal one-on-one kind of thing. I don't know. And so I would love to learn more.
Well, I can take this question.
Good.
I would take it two different ways. I think I would start with Coretta, and to like remind us that it's Coretta who knows Rustin before Martin.
Oh, okay.
That Coretta actually hears and meets Rustin both in high school at Lincoln, the Lincoln Normal School, and then again at Antioch. And she is in the kind of political milieu that puts her in. Dovetailing on Traci's point, that Coretta is in that milieu before Martin is, right? So she's met him. At the same time, to me, one of the things that's been the hardest to learn about Rustin is how vehement he is against the Northern work that King is doing, and particularly in Chicago. We know that he is vehement against the Vietnam, against the Poor People's Campaign. And so I think, right, that there is this real kind of diverging of roads between King and Rustin that happens earlier, and that is much more, Rustin is very, very critical of King in Chicago and the Northern work and the importance of that, and of a kind of disruptive protest politics, and so I think, having to reckon with the many sides of Rustin's politics, I think is hard in this moment, but important. Sadly, we have to go. And so I just wanted to remind everyone of what we're doing next month in February. Again, we are before Brown, and we will be having Matthew Delmont, Margaret Burnham, Dylan Penningroth, and Cookie Woolner. And I just wanted to thank Brandon Terry, Traci Parker, and Zoharah Simmons for joining Robin, Spencer, Antoine, and I, and all of you around the globe with us tonight, and the Schomburg Center and our tech team. Thank you so much for this really wonderful conversation.
Thank you. So nice to meet the two new people I didn't know. Looking forward to
Yes. Feeling is mutual.
you.